Because things that we haven't even discovered yet would fall under ecocentric value, right? There wouldn't be any actual.
Yeah, they could be, right? It's like biodiversity. Is biodiversity, well, do you think there's value of biodiversity, or do you think it's important? Is it a product, a service, amenity? Why do we, okay, here's the question. Why do we want biodiversity? Who consumes biodiversity?
Themselves.
Themselves? Okay, let's say you consume biodiversity. What do you use it for? Why is it good? Why is biodiversity so important?
They eat themselves aside, they are just diversity.
Why is biodiversity important? What does it do for us?
It might offer some solutions in the future
Okay.
for humans, say for example from a medical point of view, or
Yeah. What biodiversity, nobody goes out to buy biodiversity, but we're trying to preserve it all the time. And we can have too much and we can have too little. Think of it in terms of finances. You guys have to take finance classes, right? In your ag business, I assume you do. Do you have to diversify portfolios? Is diversity in a portfolio good? What does it do for you?
Like reducing the risk.
Reduces your risk, right? So biodiversity in the ecosystem is a way of organizing animals and plants and such, and it reduces the risk of loss. And it reduces the risk of loss of this stuff that we consume and we value. So biodiversity in the ecosystem is important, I think. But when it comes to the value of it, I think it's difficult to measure, because then you have to add up the rocks and the trees and the functioning of the water and the atmosphere and how everything fits together. So again, if you were to choose biodiversity, this would be a difficult one, because it has importance from an ecological perspective, but when it comes to us valuing it, if you keep asking the question why do we value it? Because it reduces risk. Who cares? Because it reduces the risk of loss. Of what? Of the stuff that we consume, or that we want to consume in the future and that we value for being there. So I think it fits over there. I was going to say the other day, you guys, I don't expect anybody to agree with me with any of this kind of stuff, with whatever I say up here. But if you don't, I need you to present an economic argument to explain why or why not, okay? So really, you're here to learn how to think in a particular way, and it's not about agreeing with me. So I don't mark your assignments like that or anything like that. So if somebody wants to tackle biodiversity, go right ahead. Any questions?
So, I just have a question, with valuing, I know you say it's going to be important. Somehow I think we still need to include the ecocentric values or importance in our anthropocentric.
I think you're exactly right. We can value the ecosystem here as a non-use kind of thing, but when it gets difficult when you start trying to measure it.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. If you were to value the ecosystem, and you were talking about parts of it, and you were doing it for a reason, like one specific, you place value on a species, that's okay. The point is when you come down to estimating these things, you have to ask people what their value is. And so if you're asking what the value of the ecosystem is, that's hard to estimate. If you say, what is your value to preserve this species for a reason, because people aren't going to use it per se, but they place value on it, you would take this approach. You'd ask the question differently if it was, what's the value placed on it for future generations? Any other questions?
I also have a question. So,
Yeah.
and what the role of the kind of environmental organizations, stuff like that, in this market? So what they contribute or not?
What's the role of environmental?
And yes, and what is their place out there?
What's the role of environmental organizations?
Yeah, all of them, like government, non-government.
Typically, if we have markets, who is best looking after markets? Business, government? Businesses, right? No market failure. You can think of this, if we tie everything together, we can talk about market failure in terms of valuing these types of things, because Okay, wildlife, how would you categorize wildlife? Is it a public good? Is it a common good? Is it a club good? Wildlife is a, huh? Yeah, depending. Is it rivalrous or subtractable? Yes. If you consume it, there's less for everybody. And it's not exclusive. You can't exclude people from using it. So we would call that a common good, right? It fits in that upper square. So in this situation, governments typically look after these types of amenities or services or products better than private market because of this nature of market failure. With bequest values and option values, often the government is required to set aside areas or tax or provide subsidies to preserve or conserve certain areas, especially for wild lands. So you would think of more government in here. For non-market things that we use, sometimes it's private, sometimes it's a joint between private and government, because there can be market failure in here. It depends on the nature of exclusivity and whether it's subtractable or not. Other roles, nonprofit organizations, quite often they'll choose a specific target, like wildlife organizations, the World Wildlife Fund, or I don't know, can't think. The only ones I know of are wildlife, so there could be others. So that it depends on the nature of the good. Okay. Did I tell you I was looking after pigeons last week before I left? The wildlife people was like, you're completely lost it now. The wildlife people they get all these pigeons, and nobody likes pigeons, right? They're right up there with rats. People call them flying rats, actually. And so the pigeon lady called and said, I need somebody to look after the pigeons. I said, well, I'm leaving, but my sister will do it. So I had these pigeons, and I'm supposed to leave the lid off the box. They stay in bins. They were in my bedroom, spare bedroom. So I go upstairs and I open the door. There's friggin' pigeons everywhere. They're flying all over the place. They escaped. One is riding around on the ceiling fan. Did I tell you that already? And the other two, you have to feed them with a little pump thing, and they wouldn't eat, and they were losing weight, and pigeons shit all over the place. Okay, moving right along. Oh, you know what? Here. Okay, so let's talk about how we measure these things. The whole point is to figure out willingness to pay or price, marginal value, whatever you want to call it. That's the goal of this exercise. So there's two methods, or let's say two approaches. And they are direct and indirect. So with the direct approach, you actually ask directly what somebody's value is. What are you willing to pay to preserve a Bengal tiger? What are you willing to pay to set aside a big chunk of the rainforest for future generations? So you'd be asking bequest value. So this is where you directly ask the question. You ask willingness to pay, WTP, or willingness to accept, WTA. What would you accept to give up a certain area? Let's say they got this Chief Whitecap Park, and they're going to turn part of it into some outdoor museum type thing. What are you willing to accept to forego the wide open spaces to have some museum? If I were to ask the willingness to pay versus willingness to accept, how would I choose which question to ask, do you think? If I ask you a question about something that you're using or that you're not using, what are you willing to pay to have a particular resource? What are you willing to accept to go without it? What would make a difference in why I asked one question or another?
Price?
What?
Price, cost?
Price, cost? Nope, nope.
You would be willing to pay a lot less than you would want to accept.
Typically,
as compensation.
you're right, right? If I have to put out money, that's likely going to be less than if I'm accepting something. That's a serious issue. But stepping back, why would I choose to ask one question or the other?
If someone's using the good or whatever it is or not.
Okay, yeah, if somebody's using it. And so who defines who's using it or who has the rights to use a good? What did we call that? There was a little section on it. You're supposed to write a wiki on it, which I can't.
Property rights.
Property rights. So all this stuff is tied together. If I'm going to ask somebody what they're willing to pay to use something, is it likely that they have the right to use it or not? If they're already using it and they have the rights to use it, then to ask them to pay to use it doesn't make sense, right? It's most likely the case that they already have the rights. So what I would ask them, what's the willingness to accept to go without, or to not use it, or to sell your rights, okay? So if people hold the rights, willingness to accept. If people don't hold the rights, it's often willingness to pay. And just like you pointed out, you're going to get different answers depending on the types of questions you ask. And if you don't do a good job of it, you wind up with some wacky answers. And that's one of the reasons that some of the literature says non-market valuation is just crap and it's for the birds. Okay, with the direct method, we call this CVM, contingent valuation. And you just directly ask somebody what it is they're willing to pay or accept, and we do this using a survey. So any kind of survey methodology is likely CVM or contingent valuation. So the indirect method is where we observe people's behavior. So it's not direct. You can ask them all kinds of questions about how far did you drive, where do you live, do you use the resource often, but you never ask them what is it, are you willing to pay or are you willing to accept? You don't ask their value. So this is where you observe. So you can, most often you're observing somebody's use of something, okay? Direct is also known as stated preference. Stated preference. Indirect is revealed preference. Okay. When you state what the value is, stated preference. When we observe or we look indirectly at what the value is, it's called revealed. So you reveal to us through your actions what your value is for a particular good or service. Okay? So what you have to do is decide when you choose your amenity or whatever it is you choose, you have to decide, are you going to value it using the direct method or 3 or 4 or 5 of the indirect methods that I'm going to talk about. So that's the second step in your performance assessment task for this particular module. Okay? So, for uses and markets, we have prices. So you don't actually, it's not a big deal. You don't actually need to do anything. If you want to look at different values, you can apply any of these, but it doesn't really make sense. There's no need for it because it's not a non-market type resource. So we have market and non-market. With non-market goods, people are actually using something. So we don't have to ask them what their value is, but we can. So we can say, we can use this indirect method. And we can use the direct method.